In the spring of 1241, a Mongol force of 20,000 horsemen crossed the plains of Silesia with a single order: destroy everything that stood between the steppe and the heart of Europe. Before them, on an open field near the city of Legnica, a Polish duke named Henry the Pious gathered the last of what he had: Knights Templar, nobles from Greater Poland, Bavarian miners turned soldiers, nearly 30,000 men who believed that armor, faith, and European discipline would be enough to stop the horsemen of the apocalypse. But what was approaching was no conventional army. It was not a force that fought the way the kingdoms of the West fought. It was a war machine perfected over generations on the steppes of Asia, trained to deceive, divide, and annihilate. And that April morning, it unleashed its art with a precision Europe had never witnessed. Because when the Polish cavalry charged the Mongol vanguard, the enemy fled. The European knights, drunk with confidence, chased the retreating riders. Then a curtain of smoke rose between the infantry and the cavalry. Arrows fell like black hail. Light horsemen emerged from the flanks. Shouts in Polish cut through the artificial fog, sowing panic, and the Mongol heavy cavalry snapped the trap shut. When the smoke cleared, the field was covered in broken steel and lifeless bodies. Duke Henry tried to flee, but was caught, pulled down, and beheaded. His head was impaled on the tip of a lance and paraded before the walls of his own city. And then the victors walked the battlefield with knives. They cut the right ear from every European corpse, one by one, methodically, until they filled 9 sacks of ears. That was how the Mongols counted their dead. And that day, the count was devastating. What happened at Legnica was not just a battle. It was a lesson in war that Europe was not prepared to receive. And to understand how 30,000 men were crushed without any chance at all, one must step back. One must return to the origin of the storm. It all began with a refusal. In the lands east of the Volga River, the Mongol Empire had reached an expanse that defied imagination. From the shores of the Pacific to the forests of Rus, the legacy of Genghis Khan spread like an unstoppable shadow under the reign of his son Ogadai. But Mongol ambition knew no natural borders. The steppes of Asia were no longer enough. Their gaze had turned westward, toward Europe. The trigger was a nomadic people, the Cumans, Turkic tribes who had lived for centuries on the plains north of the Black Sea. The Cumans were defeated by the Mongols and fled westward, seeking refuge in the Kingdom of Hungary. King Bela IV took them in, baptized them, and settled them on the Hungarian plains. From the Mongol perspective, this was an unforgivable insult. The Cumans were subjects of the Khan. They had fled from their rightful lord, and a European king was sheltering them. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, sent an ultimatum to Bela: return the Cumans or face destruction. Bela refused, and with that refusal, he sealed the fate of half a continent. General Subutai, perhaps the most brilliant military strategist ever to walk the earth, designed an invasion plan of chilling audacity. 3 armies would cross the Carpathians simultaneously to converge on Hungary from multiple directions. But there was a problem. To the north, Poland could send reinforcements. The Polish princes were bound to the Hungarian crown by blood and marriage. If Bela called for help, the Poles would march south. Subutai could not allow that. So he devised a lethal diversion. A smaller army, just 2 Tumans, between 8,000 and 20,000 horsemen, would be sent into Poland. Their mission was not conquest, it was destruction, devastation, the sowing of terror, to prevent any Polish force from marching to Hungary's aid. And at the head of that mission, he placed 2 princes of imperial blood, Baydar and Kadan, grandsons of Genghis Khan. What no one in Europe yet understood was that this diversionary force was perfectly capable of annihilating any army that stood in its path. In 1241, Poland was not a unified kingdom. It was a mosaic of rival duchies, governed by different branches of the Piast dynasty, feuding among themselves over territories, titles, and ambitions. The Duchy of Krakow, Sandomierz, Greater Poland, Silesia, each had its own lord, its own army, its own agenda. There was no central king, there was no coordinated defense. And in that fatal fragmentation lay the Mongol opportunity. The man who tried to change that was Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious. Son of the powerful Henry the Bearded, heir to the Silesian line of the Piasts. Henry was the most influential duke in all of Poland. Since 1238, he had ruled Silesia, Krakow, and part of Greater Poland. He was ambitious, devout, and strategically aware. He had dreamed of reuniting the Polish lands under a single scepter. But history had reserved for him a trial far more cruel than any dynastic rivalry. Henry was a man of deep faith. His mother, Hedwig of Andechs, would be canonized as a saint. His wife, Anna of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, connected him to the royal house of Prague. But neither his lineage nor his piety prepared him for what was coming, because the enemy marching toward him did not fight like European knights. It did not seek the honor of single combat. It did not respect the rules of feudal warfare. The Mongols fought to win, and to win they wielded deception as their supreme weapon. On the other side, the Mongol commanders were the product of a military tradition without parallel. Baidar and Kadan were not mere privileged princes. They were warriors, trained from infancy in the saddle, schooled in the art of the collective hunt, the flanking maneuver, and the feigned retreat. Every rider under their command was a horse archer capable of firing with lethal accuracy at full gallop. Every tumen operated as a coordinated organism, directed through flags and horn signals, with a system of battlefield communication that Europeans would not match for centuries. While Henry prayed in his chapels and summoned his vassals, the Mongols were already inside Poland, moving with a speed that paralyzed the capacity to respond. The invasion was lightning. In February of 1241, the first Mongol columns crossed from Rus through Volodymyr and penetrated the Duchy of Sandomierz. The city was besieged and sacked on the 13th of February. Lublin fell without significant resistance. The Mongols did not stop. They did not besiege fortresses when they could bypass them. They advanced, always advanced. On the 13th of February, a Polish force under the voivode of Krakow, Włodzimierz, tried to halt the advance at the Battle of Tursko. It was crushed. The voivode fell alongside the flower of Krakow's nobility. Weeks later, on the 18th of March, another Polish army, assembled with units from Krakow and Sandomierz, met the Mongols at Chmielnik. The result was identical: a slaughter. The Polish commanders died. The survivors fled. Panic spread like fire through dry straw. Krakow, the most important city in Lesser Poland, was abandoned by its own inhabitants. On the 24th of March, Palm Sunday, the Mongols entered the empty city and set it ablaze. Flames consumed churches, markets, and palaces. Smoke rose over the Polish plains like a signal visible for miles, a signal that said, "No one can stop us." But Henry the Pious did not flee. While other dukes hid behind their walls, Henry began gathering forces at Legnica, his stronghold in Silesia. He summoned everyone who could wield a weapon. The remnants of the armies defeated at Tursko and Chmielnik arrived, battered but willing to fight again. Nobles from Greater Poland came under the command of Sulisław, brother of the Palatine who had fallen at Krakow. Mieszko II the Fat brought his troops from Opole. A small contingent of Knights Templar sent by Pope Gregory IX joined the cause. And Henry's own Silesians and Moravians formed the core of the force. The resulting army was impressive on paper, between 25,000 and 30,000 men, according to the most accepted estimates. But reality was more fragile than the numbers suggested. The majority of the infantry was composed of poorly armed peasants, hastily recruited from Silesian villages. The contingents of Bavarian miners, led by Bolesław of Moravia, were strong men, but without real military experience. Only the heavy cavalry, the Templars, and the veteran nobles constituted a truly professional force. And that professional force was a fraction of the total. Henry knew this, and he knew something else. His brother-in-law, King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, was marching toward him with an army of 50,000 men. The Bohemians were 1 or 2 days away. If Henry could wait, if he could hold on just a little longer, the combined strength of Poland and Bohemia would overwhelm the Mongols with crushing superiority. The Mongols knew this too, and that is why they accelerated. Baidar and Kadan received reports from their scouts. The Bohemians were approaching. If the two European forces united, numerical superiority would make the mission impossible. The Mongol commanders made an immediate decision. They abandoned the siege of Wrocław and turned toward Legnica. They had to force battle before Wenceslaus arrived. Every hour mattered. What followed was a race against time that the Mongols won with the speed that defined their way of war. The 9th of April, 1241, dawned cold and grey over the plain of Legnicki Pole, roughly 10 kilometers southeast of Legnica. The field was open, gently rolling, without dense forests or significant rivers to offer natural protection. Terrain that the Europeans considered favorable for their heavy cavalry. What they did not understand was that, for Mongol horsemen, an open field was the perfect arena for their kind of war. Henry divided his army into 4 divisions. The first, under Boleslav of Moravia, included the Bavarian miners and light troops. The second, under Sulisław, gathered the conscripts from Greater Poland and a few surviving Krakowian nobles. The third, under Mieszko of Opole, formed the Upper Silesian Reserve. And the fourth, the most powerful, remained under Henry's personal command. The Silesians, the Moravians, and the Knights Templar. Before riding to the battlefield, Henry attended Mass at the Church of St. Mary. As he rode out on horseback, a stone broke loose from the church roof and fell within inches of the Duke. The people watching from the streets took it as a dreadful omen. Henry continued his march without stopping. Faith was his armor. But that morning, neither faith nor armor would be enough. On the other side of the field, the Mongol commanders had already taken position on the highest ground. From there, through a system of colored flags, they could transmit instant orders to every unit in the army. The vanguard, the feared Mangudai, light horsemen who specialized in provoking the enemy, deployed at the front. Behind them, hidden by distance and terrain, the heavy cavalry waited in silence. The horse archers, formed in flexible lines, awaited the signal. Everything was calculated, every movement rehearsed 1,000 times in the hunts of the steppe, where the Mongols had learned that the patience of the hunter always defeats the strength of the prey. Silence fell over the field. 30,000 men facing a smaller but infinitely more lethal force. The wind carried dust between the two armies. Somewhere a horse whinnied. And then began the battle that would change the European understanding of war forever. The first move was European. Boleslav of Moravia's division advanced against the Mongol vanguard. The Bavarian miners and light troops charged with determination, believing they faced a weak forward screen. The Mangudai met them with a shower of arrows fired from the gallop. But the European charge pushed them back. The Mongol riders retreated. The first contact looked like a Christian victory. Sulisław, seeing the apparent success, launched his own cavalry. The nobles of Greater Poland and the Krakowians charged at a gallop, chasing the fleeing Mongols. Excitement swept through the European ranks. The dreaded enemy, the scourge of Rus, the destroyer of cities, was retreating before the charge of Christian cavalry. But it was not retreating, it was luring. The feigned retreat was the oldest and most deadly weapon in the Mongol arsenal. A technique perfected over generations, rehearsed in every campaign from China to Persia. The Mangudai did not flee out of weakness. They fled with purpose. Their mission was to separate the heavy cavalry from the infantry supporting it, to create a void between the two forces, and in that void, to unleash hell. Henry, seeing his first divisions advancing with success, made the fatal error. He ordered his personal cavalry into the pursuit. The Templars spurred their mounts. The Silesian nobles charged with banners streaming in the wind. The 4th Division, the most powerful, abandoned its position and galloped into the open field, leaving the infantry behind. And then the smoke came. No one knows for certain what the Mongols used to create that curtain. Some sources speak of Chinese gunpowder, others of incendiary mixtures launched from portable devices. What is known is that a thick cloud of smoke rose between the European cavalry and the infantry left behind. Within minutes, the two forces were completely severed. The horsemen could not see their foot soldiers. The foot soldiers could not see their horsemen. Communication broke down. Formation disintegrated. Inside the smoke, chaos began. According to the Polish chronicler Jan Długosz, a rider shouted in Polish through the smokescreen, "Flee! Flee!" The voice in their own language sowed confusion and panic among soldiers who could not tell friend from foe. Some believed the order came from their own commanders. Others believed the battle was already lost. Order collapsed. It was at that precise moment that the Mongols unleashed their true power. Horse archers emerged from the flanks. Thousands of arrows sliced the air with a whistle that would become the most feared sound of the Middle Ages. The Mongol composite bows, crafted from layers of bone, wood, and sinew, possessed a range and power that surpassed any European bow. The riders fired at full gallop, in coordinated volleys that blanketed entire sections of the battlefield with a rain of death. The European knights in their heavy armor became slow, predictable targets. Arrows found the joints of chain mail, unprotected faces, the necks of horses. The Mongol light cavalry closed the flanks like wolves surrounding a wounded herd. They attacked, withdrew, attacked again, never lingering long enough for the European knights to engage in close combat. It was a form of warfare the Europeans had never faced. A form of warfare against which their tactics, designed for the frontal clash of heavy battle lines, had no answer whatsoever. And when the European cavalry was already exhausted, disorganized, and decimated by arrows, Baidar and Kadan delivered the killing blow. The Mongol heavy cavalry, which had remained hidden behind the lines, charged from the front. The impact was devastating. The European knights, already fragmented, were crushed between heavy cavalry at the front and horse archers on the flanks. There was no formation, there was no defensive line, only men and horses falling on a field that had become a slaughterhouse. The Templars fought to their last breath. The report from Templar Grand Master Ponce d'Aubon to King Louis IX of France would reveal the losses: 3 brother knights, 2 sergeants, and 500 men-at-arms, a near total annihilation of the order's contingent. The nobles of Greater Poland died beside their banners. The Silesians fell in waves trying to protect their duke. While the cavalry was being massacred, the Polish infantry, isolated by the smoke, received the assault of Mongol light cavalry that struck it from the flanks with surgical precision. Peasants armed with improvised spears and wooden shields stood no chance against professional horsemen who surrounded them and riddled them with arrows before charging in with curved sabers. Some tried to form defensive circles, as they had seen veterans do, but they were not veterans, they were farmers, and the Mongols gave them no time even to pray. In the midst of the total collapse, Mieszko II of Opole, seeing the scale of the catastrophe, gave the order for his troops to retreat. Some sources suggest the Mongols contributed to this decision through yet another ruse. Shouts in Polish ordering flight, amplifying the sensation of total defeat. The retreat of Opole left Duke Henry's flank completely exposed. Henry the Pious, the man who had dreamed of uniting Poland, understood that the battle was lost. With only 3 bodyguards, he attempted to escape the battlefield, but the Mongols had already sealed every route. Light horsemen pursued him across the open field. His horse, exhausted from combat, was overtaken. Henry fell. The Mongols surrounded him. What happened next was recorded by the chroniclers with a precision that chills the blood. The Duke was pulled from his mount. He was surrounded by enemy riders, and he was beheaded right there, in the mud of the field that his people would call Wahlstatt, the field of battle. His head was severed from his body and impaled on the point of a lance. The field of Legnicki Pole fell silent only when there was no one left to kill. The meadow that had been a green field, touched with frost that morning, had transformed into a landscape of nightmare. Broken armor glinted in the grey light. Riderless horses wandered among the bodies. Banners that hours before had flown on the Silesian wind now lay in mud, soaked with blood. The smell of iron, of sweat, of death saturated the air with an almost physical density. The Mongols walked the field with a meticulousness that was, in itself, a form of terror. Every European corpse was examined, and from each one, with a precise cut, the right ear was severed. It was the Mongol custom for counting the enemy's fallen. They did not use estimates or rough calculations. They used flesh. They used the body of the vanquished as a unit of measurement. Historical records state that those ears filled 9 sacks, 9 large sacks of severed ears collected from the battlefield of Legnica. If each sack held hundreds of ears, the European death toll reached catastrophic proportions. Contemporary chronicles cite figures ranging from 2,000 to 40,000 fallen. Essentially, the entire army. The estimate most commonly repeated by sources of the era is approximately 30,000 dead, virtually everyone who had marched onto the field that morning. But the most terrible image was yet to come. The Mongols took the head of Duke Henry, raised it on the tip of a lance, and rode to the walls of Legnica. There, before the eyes of the castle's defenders, of the women and children who had waited for news of victory, the Duke's head was displayed as a trophy. The screams that rose from the city were not war cries. They were the screams of a people who understood in a single instant that their world had just collapsed. Henry's mother, the elderly Hedwig, who would be canonized as a saint years later, received the news in her convent. According to legend, she did not weep. She simply said, "Let God's will be done." But history does not record what happened after those words. In the solitude of her cell, when the door closed and silence filled the space that hope had once occupied, Anna of Bohemia, Henry's wife, now a widow with 10 children, had to face not only grief, but the dissolution of the power her husband had built. With Henry's death, the Silesian line of the Piests fragmented into multiple rival duchies. The dream of a unified Poland died at Legnicki Pole alongside its champion. It would not be fulfilled for generations. The Mongols did not lay siege to Legnica Castle. There was no need. Their mission had never been to conquer Poland. It had been to shatter it. And that mission was accomplished with an efficiency that not even Subutai himself could have improved upon. With 2 Tumans, a diversionary force, they had destroyed 3 successive Polish armies in a matter of weeks: Tursko, Chmielnik, Legnica. 3 crushing victories with a numerically inferior force each time. They had burned Krakow. They had eliminated the military nobility of Greater Poland and Silesia. They had beheaded the most powerful ruler in the country. And most importantly, they had prevented any Polish force from marching south to aid Hungary. When news of Legnica reached King Wenceslaus of Bohemia, who was just 1 day's march away with his 50,000 men, the king stopped. He turned around. He returned to Bohemia to defend his own kingdom. The union of forces that would have changed the outcome of the battle never came to pass. The Mongols had calculated the timing with millimetric precision. 2 days after Legnica, on the 11th of April, the main Mongol army, under Batu Khan and Subutai, crushed the Hungarian army of King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River. 100,000 Hungarians faced 80,000 Mongols. The defeat was absolute. Bela fled through Croatia. Hungary was devastated. Half its population would perish in the months that followed. Europe was, for the first time in its medieval history, completely open to an invader from the east. There was no army between the Mongols and the Atlantic. There was no wall, no king, no crusade that could stop them. Contemporaries in Western Europe were convinced that the Mongols would march on to the plains of Germany, Denmark, and France. Terror spread through the European courts like an invisible plague. But then history pivoted on an axis no one had foreseen. On the 11th of December, 1241, thousands of miles away, in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, the great Khan Ögedei died. The law of Genghis Khan was clear. Upon the death of the supreme ruler, all princes of the blood must return to Mongolia to take part in the election of the new Khan. Subutai, who was already planning a winter invasion of Central Europe with the ultimate goal of reaching the Atlantic, was compelled to remind the princes of their dynastic duty. Batukan, Kadan, Baidar, all the commanders, they withdrew. The Mongol armies that had devastated Poland and Hungary turned around and began the long journey back to the steppe, leaving behind a ravaged Moravia, burned villages and fields covered with the dead. Europe was saved not by its valor, not by its walls, not by its knights. It was saved because an old Khan drank himself to death in his palace, 8,000 kilometers away. The echo of Legnica traveled through the centuries with the weight of a warning. The battle exposed, with unadorned brutality, the vulnerability of the European military system against a radically different form of warfare. Heavy cavalry, the pillar of feudal power, proved itself slow, predictable, and incapable of responding to an enemy who refused to fight by European rules. Feigned retreats, smoke screens, horse archers, flag signaling, all of it belonged to a level of tactical sophistication that the West would take centuries to comprehend. For Poland, the consequences were immediate and profound. The death of Henry the Pious destroyed not only the man, but the political project he embodied. The fragmentation of the Piast duchies accelerated. Silesia splintered into ever smaller domains. Polish reunification was postponed for generations. Cities such as Kraków, Wrocław, and Sandomierz had to be rebuilt from the ashes, investing enormous resources in new fortifications capable of withstanding a future invasion that everyone feared, but which, in the form they had known, would never return. The Church seized upon the trauma to preach a crusade against the Mongols. Funds were raised. Papal envoys were dispatched to the court of the Great Khan. The First Council of Lyon in 1245 organized 4 diplomatic missions to the east. The European world, which until then had regarded Asia as a land of legends and monsters, was forced to confront a military reality that surpassed it. Friar John of Plano Carpini traveled to Karakorum and returned with an account that terrified the courts of the West. The Mongols were not disorganized barbarians. They were the most disciplined and effective army on the planet, but perhaps the most enduring legacy of Legnica was the memory itself. In the collective consciousness of Poland, the 9th of April, 1241, became a sacred date. The day a Polish duke, knowing that defeat was nearly certain, marched onto the battlefield anyway to face an enemy that the rest of Europe had chosen to ignore. Henry the Pious did not win. He could not win, but he showed up. And in a Europe where emperors and kings refused to send aid, where the rivalries between Pope and Emperor mattered more than the survival of a continent, that act of showing up, of fighting while knowing the cost, acquired a meaning that transcended military defeat. The tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw bears an inscription, Legnica, the 9th of April, 1241. 8 centuries later, the Poles still honor those who fell on that field, not as victors, not as triumphant heroes, but as men who placed themselves between an unstoppable wave and a continent that refused to heed the warnings. And at Legnicki Pole, where grass grew again over the mud soaked in blood, where archaeologists have unearthed arrowheads of steppe origin and skeletons bearing the wounds of medieval combat, the silence still speaks. It speaks of 9 sacks filled to the brim. It speaks of a head on a lance. It speaks of an empire that could have reached the sea, and a duke who tried to stop it with everything he had. It was not enough. It almost never is when the world is falling apart. But it was all one man could give, and history, which forgets so many, did not forget his name.